7 days? I'm sorry, Evelyn, but you have to go.
Please, Mr. Vance, just 1 week. My hours were cut. I have a son. It's freezing outside.
I don't care, Mrs. Carter. That's not my problem.
Please, Richard, you have to.
My mom always pays. She just needs a little more time.
A little advice, son. The world doesn't care about boys like you.
Dream houses? A boy like you should learn what's realistic before he wastes paper on fairy tales.
30 years later, Richard Vance would lose the mansion he worshipped, and the boy whose dream he buried in the snow would be the last person he expected to see standing at his front door. The snow came down like judgment that night in 1996, thick and relentless, the kind of cold that found its way through coats, through doors, through the thin walls of hope itself. Evelyn Carter stood on the porch of the Vance Estates tenant cottage, her son's small hand gripped tight in hers, watching her own breath turn to fog in the porch light. She had rehearsed the words for an hour before knocking, not begging, never begging, just asking for 7 days. And Richard Vance gave her 11 minutes, 11 minutes to lose a home, 11 minutes for a boy to watch his mother break, 11 minutes for a sketchbook to disappear beneath a rich man's boot. But what Richard did not understand was this: some dreams do not die when you step on them. Some dreams wait. 30 years is a long time, long enough for a boy to become a man, long enough for an empire to rot quietly from the inside while still looking from the outside like it was standing tall. Richard Vance's decline began the way most declines do, not with a single dramatic collapse, but with 1,000 small, arrogant decisions compounding over decades. He expanded Vance Realty aggressively in the early 2000s, certain that his family name alone would guarantee success, regardless of market conditions. He refused advice from younger executives, dismissed warnings about over-leveraged properties, and treated every business setback as an insult to be weathered with pride, rather than a problem to be solved with strategy. By 2010, Vance Realty was hemorrhaging money on developments nobody wanted. By 2018, Richard had quietly sold off 3 of his 5 properties to cover debts he never spoke of at the country club. He kept the ancestral mansion above all else. It was, in his mind, the one thing that proved he still belonged among the families he'd grown up believing himself superior to. He maintained its grand fireplace, its mahogany staircase, its sweeping lawns, even as the rest of his empire crumbled around it, because losing the mansion would mean admitting, finally, that the Vance name no longer meant what it once had. Leo Carter's path ran in the opposite direction, not because luck favored him, but because every hardship taught him something he refused to waste. After that winter, Evelyn and Leo bounced between shelters and a cousin's cramped apartment for nearly 2 years before Evelyn found steady work at a hospital laundry facility and a small rental in a different part of town. It was there, at age 11, that Leo met Walter Higgins, an elderly carpenter who ran a woodworking shop 2 doors down from their apartment and who noticed the boy lingering outside his window every day after school, watching him work. "You drawing my cabinets? Or you drawing something else?" Walter asked one afternoon, catching Leo with his sketchbook pressed against the glass. Leo, embarrassed, tried to hide the book. Walter held out his hand instead. What he saw stopped him cold. Houses, dozens of them, each more detailed than the last, complete with structural notations a child shouldn't have known to make. Window placements calculated for natural light. Roof angles drawn with an instinct for load distribution that Walter, after 40 years in the trade, recognized as real talent rather than childish doodling. "Where'd you learn to draw a roof pitch like that?" Walter asked. "I didn't learn it," Leo said quietly. "I just know what looks right." Walter Higgins became the steady hand Leo had never had. He taught the boy to work wood, to measure twice, to understand how a house actually stood up rather than just how it looked on paper. More than that, he taught him patience, The kind of patience that doesn't come from comfort, but from a man who had built things with his own two hands his whole life and understood that nothing worth having arrives quickly. "Anybody can draw a dream house, Leo," Walter told him once, sanding down a cabinet door in his cluttered little shop. "Building one? That takes character. That takes showing up every single day, even the days you don't feel like it." Leo worked. He worked through high school, sweeping floors at Walter's shop, and later apprenticing there formally. He worked through community college, then through a scholarship to study architecture, supporting himself with 3 part-time jobs while his classmates leaned on family money. He slept 4 hours a night for years. He never once mentioned to any of his professors or eventual colleagues the night his family's belongings sat in the snow on Richard Vance's gravel drive. He simply carried it, quietly, as fuel. By 38, Leo Carter was not just a celebrated architect. He was the founder and CEO of Carter Residential Trust, a real estate investment firm with a singular, unusual focus, transforming neglected and foreclosed properties into transitional housing for struggling families, particularly single mothers. He had built the company on a simple principle that had never wavered since that night in 1990. Nobody should have to watch their family's belongings sit in the snow because someone with power decided their hardship was inconvenient. His mother, Evelyn, now 61 and retired, still kept the muddy, torn sketchbook on a shelf in her living room. Leo visited her every Sunday, and every Sunday he glanced at that sketchbook and felt the same cold flicker of memory pass through him. Not rage anymore, not exactly. Something colder and more patient than rage. He had, in fact, never stopped tracking Richard Vance. Quietly, through public records and a discreet team of analysts, Leo had watched Vance Realty's slow collapse for nearly a decade. He had watched the debts accumulate. He had watched Richard refuse every offer to restructure, every chance to sell with dignity, clinging instead to a mansion that had become less a home and more a monument to a pride that had outlived its foundation. And in the spring before this story's final winter, Leo Carter quietly began acquiring every outstanding loan and lien attached to the Vance ancestral estate, not through any single dramatic purchase, but through patient, methodical negotiation with 3 different lenders over the course of 8 months. Richard Vance, increasingly frail and increasingly desperate, never once suspected that the silent hand tightening around his last possession belonged to anyone he had ever met. He certainly never suspected it belonged to a boy he had once ground into the mud beneath his boot. By the time the court papers arrived, Richard Vance was 74 years old, and the mansion that had once hosted 300 guests at his daughter's wedding now echoed when he walked through it alone. His wife had passed 11 years earlier. His daughter, embarrassed by the family's collapsing finances and Richard's refusal to discuss them honestly, had moved to Seattle and rarely called. The household staff had been let go one by one over the years, until only a single housekeeper remained, coming twice a week out of what Richard suspected was pity rather than payment, since he hadn't been able to afford her wages in months. The foreclosure notice arrived on a gray Tuesday in early winter, 30 years, almost to the week, since the night he'd had Evelyn Carter and her son removed from his property. Richard read the notice 3 times at his kitchen table, his hands trembling not from age, but from a fury he hadn't expected. How dare they? How dare anyone think they could take the Vance estate? He spent the following weeks making increasingly desperate calls. Old friends from the country club who no longer returned messages, distant cousins who suddenly couldn't be reached, a bank manager who explained with careful corporate patience that there was simply no path forward that didn't involve the sale of the property. "This house has been in my family for 5 generations, Richard told the manager, his voice cracking in a way that surprised even him. "You don't understand what it means." "I understand the debt, Mr. Vance," the manager replied. "That's what the court will be looking at." The auction was scheduled for a Thursday morning in December on the courthouse steps, in weather that the local news described, almost too poetically, as the coldest day of the season so far. Richard stood on the grand mahogany staircase of his nearly empty mansion the night before the auction, looking up at the family portraits that still hung in the foyer. His grandfather in his judge's robes, his father shaking hands with a senator. Generations of Vances who had built their identity entirely around the idea that they belonged to a class of people the world simply handed things to. He told himself that night that someone would step in. A Vance family friend, a sympathetic investor, someone who understood the importance of preserving a legacy like this. He genuinely believed, with the particular delusion of a man who has spent his entire life being protected from consequences, that his name alone would summon a savior. No one came to save him. At the auction the next morning, Richard stood at the back of a small crowd of investors and curious onlookers, his cane gripped tightly, his breath fogging in the cold, exactly as Evelyn Carter's had 30 years before on his own front porch. Though Richard, lost entirely in his own humiliation, never once made that connection. The bidding opened low and climbed steadily. 2 local developers dropped out within minutes, unwilling to compete past a certain threshold. Then, a final bid came in, delivered not by a person present at the auction, but relayed by a sharply dressed legal representative holding a phone to her ear, speaking quietly to someone on the other end before announcing a number that silenced the entire crowd. The gavel fell. The Vance ancestral estate, 5 generations of inherited identity, belonged to someone else. "Might I ask," Richard said afterward, approaching the legal representative with what little dignity he had left, "who has purchased my family's home?" The woman, polite but professional, simply handed him a folded letter. "My client asked me to give you this, Mr. Vance. He'll be visiting the property tomorrow afternoon to discuss timeline." Richard opened the letter with shaking hands. It contained nothing but a single line, typed, unsigned. "You have 24 hours to gather what you need. I will be there at 3 o'clock. Richard stood on the courthouse steps in the freezing wind, the letter trembling in his grip, and felt, for the first time in 30 years, something that might have been the beginning of fear. The mansion felt enormous and hollow the next afternoon as Richard waited by the great fireplace in the main hall, the one room he had insisted on heating despite the cost, as though warmth alone might convince whoever was coming that this house deserved mercy. He had rehearsed his approach all night. He would be gracious, dignified. He would appeal to whatever sense of history this stranger might have, offer to stay on as a kind of caretaker perhaps, a living piece of the estate's legacy. He told himself this was a negotiation he could still win, the way he had told himself for 30 years that every problem could be solved if he simply refused to bend. At exactly 3 o'clock, the great oak doors, the same doors that had slammed shut on Evelyn and Leo Carter 3 decades earlier, opened. A tall man stepped inside, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that fit him with the precision of considerable wealth, carrying a leather briefcase, his presence filling the entryway with a quiet authority that made Richard's prepared speech evaporate somewhere in his throat. "Mr. Vance," the man said, his voice calm, measured, entirely without anger. "Thank you for waiting." "You have the advantage of me, sir," Richard said, attempting his old practiced charm, though his hand on his cane had gone white-knuckled. "I don't believe we've met." The man studied him for a long moment, not with hatred, Richard would realize later, but with something far more unsettling: patience. The patience of a man who had waited 30 years for this exact moment and intended to take every second of it. "We have met," the man said. "Just once, a long time ago. You wouldn't remember me. I was 8 years old and you weren't looking at me. You were looking at my mother." Something cold moved through Richard's chest. Not recognition exactly, but the bodily memory of dread, the sense of a debt suddenly called due without his understanding what it was for. "I'm afraid I don't—" "My name is Leo Carter," the man said. My mother's name was Evelyn. The fireplace crackled. Richard's cane trembled visibly now, his knuckles bone-white against the dark wood. Carter, he repeated, the name turning over in his memory like a stone being lifted to reveal what lived underneath. Carter. 1996, Leo said. The coldest night of that winter. You had your men carry our furniture out onto your gravel drive. You told my mother that letting her slide on 1 week's rent would set a bad precedent for your other tenants. Richard's face had gone the color of old paper. I'm sure I don't recall the specifics. You stepped on my sketchbook, Leo said quietly. Do you recall that? He reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew, with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred, a thin, water-damaged sketchbook, its cover still bearing the faint, permanent impression of a boot heel pressed into warped, discolored cardboard. You called my drawings fairy tales, Leo said. You told me a boy like me ought to learn what's realistic. Richard stared at the sketchbook, at the unmistakable mark of his own boot, preserved for 30 years like evidence in a trial he hadn't known was happening, and felt his legs give out beneath him. He sank slowly into the leather armchair beside the fireplace, his breath coming in short, panicked pulls. I didn't, he started, then stopped, because there was nothing true left to say. I was a different man then. I've changed. Have you? Leo asked, and there was no cruelty in the question, only a terrible, patient curiosity. You kept this house above everything else, Mr. Vance, above your marriage in the end, above your relationship with your daughter. You let your entire company collapse rather than sell this one symbol of who you believed yourself to be. That doesn't sound like change to me. That sounds like the same man, just older, and finally out of luck. Richard's hands shook violently now, the cane clattering against the marble floor as he tried and failed to find words equal to the moment. Please, Richard said, and the word came out broken, all his rehearsed dignity gone, leaving only an old man on his knees on his own marble floor, his cane fallen beside him. Please, I'm 74 years old. I have nowhere to go. I'll freeze! The words hung in the grand hall, and for a moment, the echo of them was unbearable, because Richard Vance, kneeling and begging not to be sent into the cold, had become, in that single sentence, the precise mirror of Evelyn Carter standing on his porch 30 years earlier. Leo looked down at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not satisfaction, not quite. Something heavier and more complicated than the revenge Richard clearly expected. My mother asked you for 7 days, Leo said quietly. 7 days in the coldest week of the year, after 3 years of paying you on time every single month before that. You gave her 11 minutes to clear a lifetime's belongings into the snow. He knelt down, bringing himself level with the old man, not out of cruelty, but so Richard would have no choice but to look him directly in the eyes. I'm not going to make you sleep outside tonight, Mr. Vance, Leo said. And there's a guest room prepared for you at a residential hotel downtown, paid through the end of the month. A caseworker will meet with you tomorrow to discuss long-term housing options appropriate to your circumstances. You will not freeze. You will not be left in the dark. Richard's face crumpled with something that looked almost like relief, until Leo continued. But you will leave this house. Today. Because this house is no longer going to be a monument to what you believed you deserved simply because of who you were born as. Leo stood, his voice gaining a quiet, unshakable strength. I'm tearing it down, Mr. Vance, every wall. And in its place, my company is building a residential complex, 40 units, for single mothers and their children who need exactly what my mother once needed and was refused. Free housing, job placement support, a safe place to be cold without becoming desperate. He held out the ruined sketchbook, the boot print still visible across its cover, and set it gently on the table beside Richard's fallen cane. "I'm leaving you this," Leo said, "so you remember exactly what this house cost and exactly what it's going to become instead." Security arrived precisely as arranged, not rough, not punitive, simply efficient, helping the trembling old man gather the few personal items he'd need for the night while Leo stood by the fireplace, watching the man who had once destroyed his childhood dream walk, slowly and unsteadily, toward the same oak doors he had once slammed in a frightened mother's face. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft, quiet, nothing like the brutal blizzard of 30 years before, but cold all the same. Richard paused at the threshold, looking back one final time at the grand staircase, the fireplace, the portraits of ancestors who had never once had to earn what they were given. "Why didn't you just let it go?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Why come back for this at all? You've already won everything that matters, the company, the success. Why this house?" Leo considered the question seriously, the way he considered every question that actually mattered. "Because some debts don't disappear just because the person who owes them gets old and tired," Leo said. "And because somewhere out there tonight, there's a mother standing on someone's porch asking for 7 more days. I wanted there to be a house in this town that says yes to her instead." Richard had no answer for that. He simply nodded once and walked out into the falling snow, the great oak doors closing behind him for the final time. Not slammed this time, but closed gently, deliberately, by a man who had learned across 30 hard years exactly the difference between cruelty and consequence. 6 months later, the Vance ancestral mansion was gone, its stones cleared, its foundation repurposed into something entirely new. In its place stood Harmony Commons, a bright, modern residential complex with 40 apartments, a community room, a small library, and a children's play area, where, on opening day, dozens of formerly homeless mothers and their children gathered for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Evelyn Carter, now silver-haired and walking with the careful pride of a woman who had survived more winters than most, stood beside her son as he addressed the small crowd. 30 years ago, Leo said, my mother and I stood in the snow on this exact piece of land with nowhere to go. Tonight, no family that lives here will ever have to feel that. Not because the world suddenly became kind, because someone decided to make it kind, on purpose, with the resources they had earned through their own hard work. He looked down at his mother, who was crying quietly, proudly, beside him. My mother taught me that one day, we would build something warm enough that no winter could touch it, Leo said. It just took 30 years, a lot of hard work, and one cold mansion finally coming down. Evelyn reached up and squeezed her son's hand, and somewhere inside the new building's lobby, framed behind glass where every resident would see it on their way in and out, hung a single page from an old water-stained sketchbook, the careful pencil drawing of a house with smoke curling from its chimney, and beneath it, in a child's careful handwriting, "Our house." Someday had finally arrived.